Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Mark Leibecki and Mark Melton, examining several articles and events from Providence over this past week. Firstly, Providence hosted a conversation with Israeli thinker Yoram Hazony and Joshua Mitchell of Georgetown University on conservatism, religion, and tradition. So Mark, as the host of that talk, will share a few thoughts. We posted a piece by Daryl Charles on Ukraine and the dangers of appeasing Putin's nuclear threats. We have a piece from Christianity in Crisis magazine 75 years ago about the advent of the Cold War, and I may touch on a piece I did late last week on decadent democracy versus authoritarianism. But first, to Mark Leibecki, the Yoram Hazony, Josh Mitchell talk. Yoram, obviously, is an old friend and a founder of national conservatism. Didn't really get into the theories behind that per se in this talk. His conversation was mostly about the value of tradition, of family, of institutions, of honor and civility. So not controversial, obviously, but still worth addressing. And Josh Mitchell, his conversation counterpart, shared his longtime themes about identity politics and how this current wound, as he sometimes refers to it in Western society, reflects the absence of Christian faith in the atonement and in forgiveness. And so we are left with this endless drive for some kind of self-justification that often results in the cycle of the blame game of identity politics. But first, Mark Leibecki, your thoughts on the Yoram Hazony, Josh Mitchell exchange.
Yeah, good conversation. I think in the post, there's all sorts of questions about what kind of political moment we're in. There's fear and frustration that liberalism is either under assault, or that it's got internal flaws. So you think of the old conversation that's been started by Deneen and others like him. And this, in some ways, I think fits into that. The question that Yoram posed is, what does it actually mean to conserve something? So conservatives want to conserve. What is it that we want to conserve? And how would you go about doing that? And you're exactly right that what he focuses on is the notion that conservatism begins in the home. And he looked at individual and familial responsibilities to preserve traditions. In this light, he put something of a, I don't want to say a positive spin because that sounds too trite. I don't want to say silver lining because that sounds really trite. But he recognized that COVID maybe has some, and this might sound trite as well, so I'm floundering here, but maybe hidden blessings if we're willing to see them. In that COVID compelled us to remember some of the things that in certain ways we've largely forgotten. Family life, the importance of the home. He reminisced how in the past it was more typical for everybody to be working either within or around the home more generally. And that COVID literally brought business life back into the house as people worked from home. People rediscovered their front porches, rediscovered community life, localism, things like this. And he sees that as a good. And then especially the way he cast it, I think it would be hard to dispute. So as he said, he looks at tradition, what's worth conserving, and what will it take to do so. And so I commend the video that we've recorded of the event to people's attention. And then Josh Mitchell dovetailed into that with kind of a talk on what does it mean to actually unconserve. And so he looked, as you said, at the identity politics. He compared that to the French Revolution. He compared that also to Marxism as three examples of what it means to unconserve, to try to emancipate yourself from tradition, to deracinate yourself, uproot yourself from the transcendent, and to try to foist all of meaning and all of purpose and all of reality into yourself, to make yourself the center of the universe. And he argued for how that is a very desiccated, dried up understanding of what it means to be a human being, and what the crisis facing the human condition is, and then the way that human beings can be saved. So again, I commend the talk to everyone's attention.
And we'll be posting that video already on our Providence YouTube, but we'll link to our Providence blog Monday. Is that correct, Mark Melton?
I thought it was being uploaded to the Juicy Ecumenism last email I saw, but I don't know, it might be.
Anyway, we will be providing it, if not already. So commend that to your attention. Let me briefly discuss a piece I did last week for Providence on Western democratic decadence versus authoritarianism, in that there is often the temptation by Western traditionalists, especially Christians, to have at least some sympathy for authoritarian regimes, because dictatorships tend to affirm traditional family life and some version of traditional morality, in that they seek, above all, social stability. So there is this ongoing temptation to admire that aspect of their societies. But as I point out, these forms of sexual decadence are often in dictatorships exceeded by vaster forms of immorality, murder, torture, imprisonment of political opponents, suppression of opposition, and any free speech. And of course, there is plenty of sexual decadence under dictatorships as well, that they hypocritically refuse to typically acknowledge. So this temptation must be carefully navigated, and it's certainly no pretext for Western societies to neglect to reflect on our own sins, even as we espouse and defend and promote our notions of democracy and freedom for all. So, of course, I commend my own article to you. Mark Melton, tell us a little bit about this piece from Reinhold Niebuhr's magazine, Christianity in Crisis, 75 years ago, about Christian ambivalence as the Cold War was unfolding, a symposium. Several of his colleagues, some of whom supported an assertive stance against the Soviet Union, others thought it would be unchristian to begin this new strategic struggle with a, until recently, ally. So what say you, Mark?
Right, so kind of giving the historical context here, in March 1947, Truman announced a new doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, where the United States would help Greece and Turkey fight off communism, or to resist communism. And Greece needed the aid more at the time, but the United States couldn't really give aid to Greece without giving aid to Turkey, because they were rivals. And so you didn't want to alienate Turkey so that they could side with the Soviet Union. But so they both got aid. Greece needed it more because it was in the middle of a civil war. Up to this point, the United Kingdom had been giving aid to Athens to fight off the communist guerrillas, starting in before World War II ended. And at the time, the British economy is faltering. They are having coal shortages and they're having a lot of problems. So they can't afford to continue the effort to resist the communists. And so this is really, for many historians, this speech by Truman to say we're going to replace the British support with American support was the beginning of the Cold War. I think some historians give different dates. I think some, especially the Soviets, I think they dated it to slightly earlier, to Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. But for many, they say this is the start of the Cold War, if it hadn't already started. And the US wasn't directly involved in the fighting. They were giving aid. We gave them, I believe, some old World War II aircraft, Hellcats, or diver, I can't remember the exact name of the plane, but we were giving them planes and weapons and other aid and support to fight off the communists. So the government in Greece, though, was not all squeaky clean, and there was corruption. And so there were some questions from Americans of, was this the right policy? And most of the writers that I found in Christianity in Crisis, they were in favor of it. For instance, you had this Virginia politician, Francis Miller, who had written, I think he was on an editorial board for Christianity in Crisis, but he supported the efforts. Others did as well. And an Episcopalian, if I could pull up his name here, He was not in favor of it for a couple of different reasons. Edward Parsons, and so an Episcopalian bishop, I believe. So he kind of gave different reasons. One, it bypassed the United Nations, and so he was in favor of kind of going, if there was an international dispute, to go through the United Nations instead of doing this unilaterally. He also brought up the corruption of the Greek government. I believe the referendum that brought back the monarchy, there was questions about how legitimate was the referendum, though my understanding is it would have passed without the corruption, but that was done under the British before the Americans came in. And also he called the government reactionary. And another point he made that I kind of see this in other parts of Christianity in Crisis, where the argument was, if the people have prosperous, jobs, they have good economic opportunities, they don't have a lot of reasons to support communists, and the communists will just fade away. They kind of just assume that as long as the popular will is there, the communists will not succeed. They kind of fail to forecast how the communists may just use arms, especially if they're getting arms from the Soviet Union or from Greece. They're actually getting it from Yugoslavia. So, most of them were from Yugoslavia, and being able to overthrow the government, impose their will, regardless of what the majority of the people wanted. And so I think he kind of has a failure of imagination of just how might the communists play out. He seems to think that communists might be able to exist in a somewhat democratic system, which over the years, the Czechoslovak coup in 1949, a year or so later, 1948. I think that kind of disproves his ideas of what's going on.
Well, and once again, we are focused on Russia. Mark Leibecke, Daryl Charles's piece warns against accommodating Putin in terms of his nuclear threats, and wants a more assertive response in terms of defending Ukraine without defining exactly what that might be. I found his piece a little bit startling in that the Western response to the Ukraine invasion has been quite remarkable. Unprecedented sanctions, unprecedented arms shipments. The US just announced $30 billion in additional aid to the Ukraine. The Ukrainian resistance has been courageous and extraordinary, for which the Ukrainian people deserve the supreme credit, but would not be possible were it not for the shipment of Western arms and the sharing of Western intelligence. So it's not quite clear to me exactly what more the West could do short of direct military intervention. What think you, Mark Leibecke?
Yeah, it's complicated, and Daryl's passions are well founded. I don't know if I'm equally passionate about it all, but very close. Lots of good friends still in Ukraine. Lots of friends presumably on the front line. Lots of friends certainly helping out in Kyiv and Kharkov and other places. The Western response has been great. That's obvious. On the one hand, I think an argument can be made that more should have been done in the roll-up, certainly before 2014, certainly between 2014 and the second major invasion, the full invasion. Arguably, the Biden administration rolled some of the assistance. Having given all the weapons that Zelensky has asked for, to say nothing, and this is probably more to Daryl's point, to say nothing about no-fly zones and certain things like that. So we've argued in our own pages, right, that there's a lot that we might want to do. There's a lot that maybe we ought to do, but there's also a lot that we can't do because there's lots of other things we ought to do. Not, act so rashly that Putin is blows up the world. He doesn't attack a NATO ally and so forth. So, Daryl is, I think there are things that we could have done better. There are things that we could do better. At the same time, we have done a lot that has been remarkable. And so I project forward and I wonder, on the eve of a Ukrainian victory, which, God willing, will come. I think an accounting does have to be made of the Western response, what more we could have done, how fast we could have done it, while at the same time recognizing the goods that we did. So it will be in some ways a shared victory. I think, I think there will be some things that we have to account for. And the Ukrainians will have to recognize that our hands are prudentially tied in certain ways. So I think after this, after the smoke clears, will be lots to talk about. So maybe I split the difference a little bit between you and Daryl. But Daryl, I hope he understands that there is only so much that we can do. Our hands are in many ways quite tied. We see Putin's latest provocations with the missile tests and his ongoing saber rattling. I think where Daryl is particularly right is that Putin mustn't be allowed to get away with nuclear blackmail. But it's one thing to assert that, and then it's another thing, as his essay, as my essays have demonstrated, it's another thing to argue for an effective, prudential, appropriately calibrated response. All of that is true, that he shouldn't be allowed to get away with it. I think the question right now is how do we reassert the escalation dominance that we once enjoyed, and how do we put him on his back heels without pushing him into a corner where he feels that he has fewer choices than he actually does. So I think it's a hopeless mess. I think this dovetails maybe nicely with the piece that we published from Trudy and Russ Chun, where they lament some of the same things, that there's only so much we can do and we don't know the right things to do. And in some ways, this is maybe small solace, but Christians can rest in the fact that the one thing we know we can do is to help where we can in terms of the Ukrainian people themselves. They call it a glass of cold water. There are all sorts of good things that we can be doing to assist Ukrainian refugees, which has an indirect, if not insignificant, effect on the war effort itself. The Ukrainian government doesn't need to worry so much about its refugees if the Western states, in addition to the military aid we're giving, if we help them with humanitarian assistance. So hopelessly complicated, incredibly frustrating. I'll leave it there.
Walking a fine line, but I think we do have to remember Reinhold Niebuhr's constant warning against hubris and the assumption common to all Americans that we have unlimited power that can be wielded any ways we choose without negative ramifications. So
no, that's right. The one, I mean, this is scant silver lining, but one thing that this has taught us is that we do not have absolute power. So if nothing else, this is going to be one of the takeaways. You're absolutely right on that.
On that note, gentlemen, Mark Levesque, Mark Melton, thank you for this latest episode of Marksism. Until next week, bye-bye.